In this presentation, I'll be talking about a framework for planning lessons and units called Backward Design. Much of the content of this presentation is taken from the Wiggins and McTighe text called Understanding by Design, which was published in 2005. So as the name suggests, backwards design is about designing our lessons and units backwards. But what does it mean to develop a lesson backwards? It means starting with a really clear sense of what students will know, understand, or be able to do as a result of instructional activities. So in other words, what will a student know, understand, or be able to do when they walk out of the classroom at the end of the lesson that they didn't know, didn't understand, or weren't able to do when the lesson started? So backwards design means to start your lesson design knowing what the outcomes of instruction are before you start building that instruction. It means having a clear sense of what your learning outcomes are from the very start. Too often, lessons and units are designed with no clear sense of their destination. For example, we may come up with a fun activity, like having students research a state and putting together a brochure around that state. So we design the lesson around that activity. We assign students states, decide what resources they should use to find out about their state. We give them paper or a computer with which to design it. But what is the activity designed to support students with other than knowing more about their state? Since we've not really thought much about that, since we didn't really have any thoughtful learning outcomes in mind, we're not even sure what we're expecting from students' final project, the brochure. So the assignment description ends up sounding something like this. Your brochure must have state name on front, include 3 facts about state, include 3 images per page, be colorful, and be free of grammar and spelling errors. This example of an activity-based design instead of backwards demonstrates the fallacy of such a design. Wiggins and McTighe speak directly to the problem of the activity-based design in their book, Understanding by Design. They say that an activity-oriented curriculum is one in which students may participate in a variety of hands-on activities. It may be engaging for students, but it leaves one wondering what learning will endure. On the screen, you see an example from their book of an activity-based design. For 2 weeks every fall, all the 3rd grade classes participate in a unit on apples. The 3rd graders engage in a variety of activities related to the topic. In language arts, they read about Johnny Appleseed and view an illustrated film strip of the story. They each write a creative story involving an apple that illustrates and then illustrate their story using tempera paints. In art, students collect leaves from nearby crab apple trees and make a giant leaf print collage that hangs on the hallway bulletin board adjacent to the 3rd grade classroom. The music teacher teaches the children songs about apples and science. They use their senses to carefully observe and describe characteristics of different types of apples. During math, the teacher demonstrates how to scale up an applesauce recipe to make enough for all 3rd graders. What this describes is unfortunately far too common. Wiggins and McTighe ask about this apple-themed unit. To what ends is the teaching directed? What are the big ideas and important skills to be developed during the unit? Do the students understand what the learning targets are? To what extent does the evidence of learning from the unit, the leaf print collage, the creative writing stories, the completed word searches, reflect worthwhile content standards? What understandings will emerge from all this and endure? Too often we create lessons and hope that there is something in them that's worthwhile. But as Wiggins and McTighe point out, we don't want to just throw content and activities at the wall and hope something sticks. They go on to say, quote, in other words, we want understanding by design as opposed to understanding by good fortune. We need to think of lesson and unit design work as the intellectual equivalent of a GPS device in our car. By identifying a specific learning destination first, we're able to see the instructional path most likely to get us there, end quote. So with backward design, we start by identifying our desired results. We start by identifying student learning outcomes. Then we work backwards from there to determine acceptable evidence for learning. Only then are we ready to plan learning experiences and instruction designed to support students with the learning outcomes we've identified. So this presentation will focus primarily on identifying desired results, although I will provide a brief example of determining acceptable evidence. So Bloom's taxonomy can be a nice support for us as we articulate learning outcomes. The taxonomy assists us in identifying learning outcomes that range in levels of cognitive thinking. So these levels are knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, and synthesis. Here's a list of verbs that we often associate with each level of Bloom's taxonomy. These lists are all over the internet. You do have to be careful with them though. Bloom's taxonomy cannot think for you. Just because a learning outcome you have written includes a verb in the comprehension category, for example, that does not automatically make it a comprehension learning outcome. You still need to consider yourself whether what the outcome asks of students truly requires comprehension. As another example, consider point out under analysis. I could say that as a result of this lesson, students will be able to point out which states on the map that I've created are mislabeled. However, that does not require analysis. It simply requires students to know which states are which on a map. It's a knowledge-based outcome. So here are some examples of learning outcomes at each level. So an example of a learning outcome at the knowledge level would be students will be able to list the 3 types, classes, or classes of rocks. So all students need to do here really is regurgitate what they've been told. Comprehension. Students will be able to explain in paragraph form the information communicated in a graph. But this really requires students to restate and interpret, so sort of a step above knowledge. Application. Students will be able to produce an effective, persuasive essay. So skillful persuasion requires that the writer be able to apply learned information in an effective way. Analysis. Students will be able to analyze a transcript of a presidential debate by distinguishing between those passages that attack a political opponent personally, as opposed to those that criticize or challenge the opponent's political stances. Here, a student would need to be able to separate or break up a whole, which would be the debate, into its parts to gain an understanding of the nature of the contents or ideas, so analyze. And then finally, synthesize. Students will be able to develop a coherent presentation that synthesizes information from various sources and is designed to communicate reasons why there is a movement in the U.S. to replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. So here, students will need to be able to pull together information to develop a coherent and effective explanation. So let's look at the process of developing a learning outcome. We usually, but not always, we usually start with an academic standard as our first step. Academic standards are not learning outcomes themselves, though. They inform learning outcomes. So let's take a look at this one. 3.RN.3.3. This is an English language arts standard, and the 3 at the start tells us it's a 3rd grade standard. The RN stands for reading nonfiction. So this standard focuses on informational or expository texts as opposed to stories. And this may go without saying, although I've seen a lot of people try it anyway. Please, you cannot unpack a standard if you yourself do not understand it. So you want to always start out this process making sure that you have done a little bit of research on the standard if it's confusing to you, to be sure that you understand it before you start trying to identify learning outcomes that align with it. So there are a lot of learning outcomes that would align with this standard or are related to it, and here are just a few of them. Students will be able to define the word perspective. Students will be able to explain what a perspective is and provide a concrete example. When given a nonfiction text in which the author provides his or her perspective on a topic, students will be able to identify and explain the author's perspective on that topic. After reading a nonfiction text in which an author provides his or her perspective on a topic, students will be able to explain their own perspective on the topic. And finally, when given a nonfiction text in which the author provides his or her perspective on a topic, students will be able to compare and contrast their perspective with the perspective of the author. So which one or ones you choose depends on your students, depends entirely on your students, on their prior knowledge, on their understandings, on the skills they're bringing with them into your class. So going back to the backward design approach, the second step would then be to determine acceptable evidence of learning given your learning outcome. So let's assume we're focusing on this outcome. When given a nonfiction text in which the author provides his or her perspective on a topic, students will be able to compare and contrast their perspective from the perspective of the author. The assessment might be something as simple as having students complete a Venn diagram in response to a text, indicating in the area where the circles overlap, where the student and the author share perspectives, and indicating the student's unique perspective on the left-hand side and the author's unique perspectives on the right. So instruction then is the third step in backward design. And you'd then focus on scaffolding students' abilities to identify the author's perspective towards a topic in a given text, identifying ways in which, as a reader, your perspective overlaps with the author's perspective, and identifying where your perspectives differ. And you could use the Venn diagram, and you should use the Venn diagram as both a teaching tool as you model the skill and provide coached practice, as well as a tool for evaluation. When you move students to the point, for the evaluation, when you move students to the point where they're practicing the skill independently. Or you could just take the topic of author's perspective, find some worksheets online that focus on the topic, and throw content and activities at the wall and hope something sticks. Better, though, is to start with the outcomes in mind, so that what you develop for your students is a lot more meaningful, and the learning that happens in the classroom endures.